So shall we start at the very beginning then and sort of go right back to your childhood and just sort of be interesting just to hear you what, sorry?
In the great words of Julie Andrews, let's start at the very beginning.
I'm reading her autobiography at the moment. It's very comforting because, you know, her life was obviously filled with trauma and highs and lows and drama, and it was sort of, you know, jet setting all over the world and whatnot. But just hearing all of that in her very comforting voice that you can sort of hear as you're reading it, it just helps sort of at the end of the day, just keep, you know, the nerves in check.
Exactly. It sounds a really good idea.
Yeah. So I can recommend it to everybody listening into our interview with Sarah Travis. Julie Andrews' autobiography is well worth a read during these stressful times. But yes, let's start at the very beginning, as Julie said. Tell us a bit about your childhood and, you know, growing up and your influences and when you started to really get interested in the theatre.
Well, both my mother and father played piano, and my mother said when I was about 4, I used to sit at the piano and just sort of, you know, mess around. And I think they saw that. I don't think they saw much musicality then, but I think they saw I had an interest or a connection to hear, obviously connecting the movement of playing and the sound coming out. So I did have very early piano lessons. My father used to take me to concerts in Bristol. I was brought up near Bristol, and my father was a great music lover, and he actually played by ear, and he played hymns on the piano. So I think I got most of my musicality from my father. So he took me to Bristol Hall. Oscar. Hi, Oscar. But the big influence for me was I was just so lucky. I had an amazing secondary school teacher, Mr. Thomas, David Thomas, who really nurtured, I think, he saw that I could play by ear. I used to play pop songs from the piano, and he really sort of brought me on with that and encouraged me. And I used to play for theatre shows at school, and I suppose so. Then I started to I played for gang shows. It was very rural where I was brought up, so I don't know whether gang shows still exist, but I got a real love for it. I loved the connection. I found it very exciting. I loved the community of it. I made a lot of friends through theatre, and my schooling, it was all about sport. I was quite sporty, and music, and every lunch hour, every sort of after school, it was a tussle between, do I do music or do I do sport? Because I was captain of the netball team. I played hockey for county. I did a lot of tennis and racket sports. So I still have a passion for sport, but music started to sort of take over and has continued to do that. So it's my teacher. He pushed me to go to university, where I did a music degree at City University. And then did a composition sort of diploma at the Guildhall School of Music. So country bumpkin arriving in London I was so green. I'd never been on a tube before. It was very scary. But I have to thank my music teacher, because I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing now. I don't know what I'd be doing, but you know, I'm here still, hopefully going, and yeah. Very, very lucky to have a teacher who was so inspiring and helpful.
Yeah, I think so many of these chats, and certainly my own experience, so many of us have been blessed that there was a teacher, somebody who could recognise our passion and our talent for theatre, for music, for the arts, and was able to really nurture it and push us in the right direction and sort of signpost those sort of moments and sort of push you on. And I think we're all just incredibly grateful, and you just hope with all of the cuts within education, certainly the curriculum, you know, being sort of stripped of culture and arts and theatre and music, that you hope that the teachers are still able to take those moments to recognise that those unique kids who have that sort of eye on the arts and culture and can still guide them and I guess lead them to places like Curve or music hubs in their cities and towns. It's so important.
Well, yes, absolutely, because I had no, apart from, as I said, my mum and dad playing piano, I had none of my family worked in the arts. I didn't know about it, you know, and as I say, I was from quite a rural area, and apart from sort of going with my father to concerts, and Bristol Hippodrome pantomime is very clear in my head. That was my big sort of first theatrical live experience. I remember the trumpet playing in the pit, and it was so exciting. But my teacher pushed me to go to London. Probably pushed my parents, because we didn't have the money. I mean, in those days I had a government grant. I wouldn't have been able to go. They didn't have the money to send me there. But yes, I mean, cuts. And it's always, isn't it interesting? It's always the arts that get cut. I mean,
I know.
We'll talk about this later, obviously, and some of the questions will come to that. But yeah, I mean, it's such an early level.
And isn't it bonkers that today, when we're all locked in our living rooms, in our flats, in our homes, we're watching Netflix, we're watching archive shows online, whether it's Curve's memoirs or Puss Being Earnest, you know, NT's One Man, Two Governors. We're listening to music, we're writing music, we're reading Julie Andrews' autobiography. Everything we're doing at the moment is consuming culture. It is watching shows, it is writing shows, it's, you know, we're all consuming culture.
And culture's the one thing that has completely stopped, and is probably one of the last things that's going to start up again. And let's hope that when it does start up, that people will come back with enthusiasm and confidence and support the arts, because gosh, it's such an important community, isn't it? It's freedom of expression, comment, political comment. It's so important. And as you say, we're all now needing it. It's a lifeline, isn't it?
It literally is a lifeline. And as you say, it's always the first thing to get cut. But in terms of our mental health, our mental well-being, and also being able to watch stories that can connect us, because there's so many things I find that you wouldn't want to talk about with a parent or a loved one or a partner. But actually you go to your local theatre and you see a play about grief, or you see a play about sort of profound joy, or, you know, sort of finding new ways to connect to people. And that enables a sort of discussion, as well as just being really entertaining and a really like fun thing to do.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
So what, like obviously music's been such an important part of your life, as you say, right from when your parents sort of sat you down in front of the piano. Who are the musicians and composers sort of growing up that sort of shaped your narrative, if you like, and inspired you?
I suppose from a pianistic point of view, the first person that really kicked in with inspiration was when I was at the Guildhall School of Music. I did a composition course, but I was allowed to have piano lessons as part of the course, and I chose to have jazz piano lessons. I was always quite a bad student. I would call myself a busker, because technically speaking, I can't do the really sort of florid, intricate sort of technical pieces, but I'm a feel-based musician. So my teacher, he's dead now, sadly. I think he died of copious amounts of alcohol and drug abuse, probably, because he was a troubled soul, but he was an absolute genius. His name is Lionel Grigson, and he was a bebop fan. So he was a real Charlie Parker fan, and our lessons were, I would either just sit and listen to him for an hour, or if there were two pianos in the room, we'd just play together and we'd just improvise. And he massively inspired me. And he was a real Bach fan, actually, which I am as well, because a lot of Bach is quite, if you break down the harmony of Bach, it's quite jazz, that you can see how jazz sort of comes from that, actually. The harmonic structures and are quite, they're quite intricate, and when when you improvise over those structures, it actually, I think it was it Jack Lussier who played jazz Bach? I can't remember the composer now, but anyway. So Lionel Grigson was massively inspiring. And I suppose other pianists that do it for me are people like Bill Evans, who, rather than someone like Mark Tatum, who's a very, very florid pianist, if you listen to any Bill Evans, every note is beautifully chosen, and he, like George Shearing, it's all about the chord structures, and they're very, very dense chord structures, but they're economic, and every chord is beautifully chosen. There's no sort of fluff, and it just cuts to my soul. Bill Evans, listen to some Bill Evans, because it's just absolutely beautiful. And more recently, pianist-wise, I would say Wally Harper, who sadly is no longer with us, who used to accompany Barbara
Cook, yeah.
And I was quite late to Barbara Cook, but I was lucky to see her twice before she died. And Wally Harper was her accompanist for years. They were great friends. I think he famously sort of picked her. Barbara Cook had a very troubled life, and before her, she had a sort of resurgence in the last sort of 10, 15 years after having very, very low times. And I think Wally Harper literally picked her up and said, look, you know, let's work together again, and he pulled her out of her depression and her problems. But my goodness, when he accompanied her, he literally never took his eyes off her. Everything, he was always there to catch her. He's the most extraordinary accompanist, and accompanying is such an art, because it's all about listening and sometimes leading, finding the middle ground with someone. There's an unspoken connection when you're accompanying a singer or a player, and for me, he was just the best. So I was lucky enough to see him twice, and he's the only person I've gone around to a stage door to cue and actually say thank you to him, because he made a massive effect on me.
And did you meet him? Did you get to speak to him? That's wonderful.
But he was so gracious. I think he was, because I just kept saying thank you. You are just such you are the best. And he did look slightly taken aback, but I needed to say it to him, because I think obviously, you know, she was the star of the show and was getting most of the attention, but for me, he was as much the star of that show, and I know she obviously valued his work as well. But yeah, and composers, I suppose early on, because my father, he's sadly not with us now, but he was a great Mozart and Beethoven fan, and we both were very interested in requiems. I don't think I was depressed when I was younger, but no, but he loved, because he was quite churchy and religious, and he loved all the religious sorts of requiems and masses, and I was studying it for my A-level, so particularly Mozart's Requiem, I think, and the Lacrimosa, which we played at his funeral.
Just exquisite, isn't it?
It's beautiful. I think it's one of the best, actually.
Yeah.
And it's the last piece of music he was writing before he died. You just sort of feel that he knew it was coming, you know. And so I suppose, and then a bit later on, I would say Stravinsky, because I think at the time he was writing, things were so turbulent, and he changed the way 20th century music sort of went. And then later, theatre composers, obviously Sondheim, because I've been lucky enough to meet him. Jerry Herman, because I've worked on a couple of his shows, rest in peace. And then the early ones, I'd say Cole Porter, Gershwin, Bach and Harnick. I mean, you know, there are so many. They all have their place, don't they? And
absolutely. And in the way that you sort of described the jazz influences coming from the back, and how you'd sort of you'd observe that, do you see in our theatre composers, whether it's Sondheim or Jerry Herman, are there links you can make back to the sort of classical repertoire? Are there sort of interesting sort of lessons we can take from, you know, where we can see the composers of today have have borrowed and been inspired by classical composers? Is there?
Well, certainly Bernstein. I mean, and obviously we recently worked on West Side Story, and what's so wonderful about Bernstein is he was a classical composer in his own right, but something like West Side Story has so many other jazz idioms and like the mambo and, you know, so many sort of field-based sort of elements to it, which fuses so brilliantly with the classical. I mean, Bernstein, I do sort of, and Sondheim in a way, I think they equate with Stravinsky. I mean, Stravinsky obviously was a little bit earlier, but they did change the course of musical theatre. They broke the rules, which I don't think there should be rules really in theatre. And I think that the composers that have sort of stayed are the ones that broke the rules. Jerry Herman, I always think gets bad press because his music is I think is seen as a bit insipid sometimes, but I think he wrote from the heart. And you know, anyone that can write a song like "I Am What I Am," you know, or "They Won't Send I Won't Send Roses," or his music it does really cut through. I was very lucky to meet him actually as well. Sorry, it's a clang. But when I did Sweeney Todd in America back in whenever it was, 2005, John Doyle, who I was working with at the time, we were working on Mac and Mabel, which toured in this country, and we had to meet him to talk about getting the rights, and it was so sweet. We met him. I don't know whether he always did, but we met him in his suite at the Waldorf Hotel. And we were told we were going for tea at 5 o'clock. And John and I think we'd been rehearsing all day, and we both said, "Oh God, I hope he offers us a gin and tonic," because we'd had a long day. But there was no gin and tonic. It was definitely tea. Right. But he was the most charming, so lovely, so supportive, so down to earth. It was lovely, and I'll treasure that actually. I really will.
What an extraordinary thing. And
Adam Gettle is the other.
Yeah, and I think like Jerry Herman.
Sorry.
No, I was just going to say that, I mean, his audiences have always delighted and loved his work, haven't they? And, you know, those songs are so joyous, but yet filled with such sort of profundity and pain. And audiences respond to that and respect it, and have always relished Jerry Herman. It's only the sort of snooty critics who very often, they're either behind the curve and the audience is ahead of them, which is often the case, or they perceive something to be popular, so it's sort of, you know, dismissed. And popular's great. I mean, Andy Warhol was popular, Andrew Lloyd Webber's popular, all of these great artists are popular, and that's why they're great artists, because people want to consume their work and their art.
Yes, absolutely.
And so after you'd done your training, what was your sort of first foray into the theatre? How did you actually get your first gig, and what sort of work were you doing? Were you MDing? Were you supervising straight away?
Yes, on the Fringe. So I did 2 college shows at City University, one of which we were banned by our lecturers. We did a production of Hair, which was a bit racy, I think, for our lecturers. I don't think I don't think there was nudity, but I just think they thought the subject matter was a bit too racy at the time. And then I did a very unknown, and probably should remain unknown, piece called The Curse of the Werewolf. I can't think there's anything good to say about that production, probably. So the first Fringe production I did when I left college, because I thought, well, I want to work in theatre, but I had no connections, no sort of path to follow. We didn't have social media when I left college. So I rang a guy. I'd accompanied a friend for an audition. I think it was for Blues in the Night, which Neil MacArthur was so this is the same Blues in the Night that Sharon D. Clark has recently just done at the Kiln brilliantly. So this is probably late 80s. Carol Woods, Maria Friedman. It's the first time I saw Maria Friedman do anything did this production of Blues in the Night, and I talked to Neil MacArthur after this Friends audition. He was so lovely, and he said, "Oh, what are you up to at the moment?" And I said, "Well, I'm looking for work." And he said, "Well, meet me for lunch." Again, the kindness of people in this business. So I met him for lunch, and he just encouraged me, and he listened to me for an hour, and he gave me about 15 phone numbers of MDs who were working in the country at that time and in the West End. He said, just ring them up and just sort of talk to them. You might be able to dep in the West End or get started. And I did that. And I depped on 42nd Street that was at Drury Lane. I was so green. I was so nervous. Luckily, the piano part was it was quite a sort of comping sort of part, and there was nothing to expose. Apart from, there was a little tremolo. I'm trying to think what it would be now. It's probably the beginning to something like the stars, 9:15. There was probably like a ding before the singer comes in. And I think I did a ding rather than a ding, and everybody looked at me in the band, you know, because I'd played the wrong thing. So it was quite stressful. And I just remember the guy that I was depping for used to have snuff. He was a snuff sniffer. I don't know anyone who so.
Are you sure it was snuff?
Well, I think it was, but there was this sort of little tin that he had on the side, and because I went in and shadowed him and watched him, and every so often between cues he'd go, but it wasn't anything terrible. It's funny what you remember, isn't it? And the smell I remember.
Wow.
And then my first actual MDing job was for a show called Wide Eyes Kingdom that started at the Battersea Arts Centre, and it lasted for I think 5 performances because no one came to see it.
Oh, blimey.
It was my first, again, so green, and the director, who I won't name, was sacked by a mutiny by the company, and there were very, very good people who are all still working and doing really well in that company. And I was far too young and too green to say anything, but they just thought he was terrible, and we had to get a new director. But I remember this mutiny, and I thought, is theatre always like this? Get rid of the director. It was quite hardcore. So it was quite a bumpy ride, really, my first few jobs. But yeah.
Yeah. And it's interesting, like describing your relationship, for example, with Neil MacArthur, and you know, having a coffee, and as you say, him being so generous, and then sort of signposting you to a sort of number of people. It feels like the business, the industry has changed sort of unrecognisably, hasn't it, from those days where, I mean, I remember when I was at Sheffield as a trainee director, you know, there was about 10 of us, young directors. We'd meet once a year, share stories, share experiences, and there was something really collegiate and sort of very human about that. But nowadays, you know, social media, the way we communicate is fantastic, but it almost feels like there's so many of us now, and it's sort of, it's communication's never been better, but in some ways it's harder to make those human connections. It's harder to get to those people who are really going to be able to sort of help you and signpost you, I guess.
It's really hard, and I certainly had no confidence, and I don't think I still do really, and I'm quite shy. I'm very good at talking one-to-one, or if I have to walk into a crowded room, you know, that's my worst sort of nightmare, and having to sort of, you know, connect. And I'm quite shy, and I think certainly when I was 22, 23, and not knowing what I wanted, you know, where everything was going, and it was hard to connect. It was hard to sort of say, look, I'm really good. I can do this. You know, that's not me. I mean, I think self-promotion is hard. I don't even now have a website. It's not something it's not natural to me to do that. My self-promotion is my work, I think. And I like to hope that when I started out, the more work I got, the work just spoke for me, really. And I think as I've got older, that's what's given me my confidence. God, this is like a therapy session, isn't it? But I certainly, I feel identified more now as a person by my experience and my work. And it makes me feel more confident and more that I have something to say. And I don't think I had that before. I felt inadequate, and I still have that imposter syndrome. You feel inadequate and you feel like you shouldn't be, I'll be found out at some point, But certainly, Neil MacArthur, if you're listening to this, Neil, thank you, because he listened and he helped me at the time when I really didn't know how to get into the business at all. I didn't have the confidence. But certainly some of those phone calls I made would have led to other things. There's no question. So he did. Yeah.
And I think it's absolutely, obviously we know each other very well. So, it rings sort of loudly with me that, people who are busy self-promoting and sort of pushing themselves to the foreground, you can do all the self-promotion in the world. You can have the best, grooviest website, best social media, but in the theatre, in the pure arts that we're engaged in, the work will always be the thing that speaks for us and which will speak the loudest and most clearly, because fundamentally, when you sort of boil away all the nonsense and all of the networking and all the sort of industry that goes into making a piece of theatre, really all you're left with is the actors and the musicians, the text or the music that they're playing or speaking, and the audience. And that three-way triangle is the most important thing, and ultimately it either works or it doesn't it? I mean, it's as simple as that. And you've had many shows that work amazingly and have really sort of we'll go into the actor musician stuff in a moment, but have really sort of changed the course of British theatre, and it either works or it doesn't. Audiences either respond or they don't, and that's really how we want to be judged, isn't it?
I think so. And yes, and as you say, we'll talk about it in a minute, but certainly that feeling of, in sometimes words, excited and scared, that always rings when I'm working on something that's difficult, or you can't quite see the way through it, or you think, oh, is this just terrible? Is this not going to work? And sometimes those are the ones that turn out the best, because you are probably digging a bit deeper. You're taking more risks, you're doing something that's a little bit out of your comfort zone maybe, or you're making decisions where you don't know whether they're the right decisions. But that's the beauty of theatre, isn't it? That you're always searching and looking. No decision is wrong, really. You make the decision that instinctively feels right at the time and is right for the storytelling. And
and I think those moments of vulnerability and, as you say, fear, where it's an excited fear because you're entering the unknown and you're perhaps traveling down a path in rehearsals or in the creative process or previews, which is unnerving, but unnerving in an exciting way. As you say, they reap the biggest rewards, and being vulnerable is the greatest thing we can be, and being open and sort of able to trust and take risks and make mistakes. As you say, there is no wrong or right. It's just what we instinctively as a team feel is right in that moment. But, another group of people would have made a different choice, and that's equally valid.
Yes, absolutely. I think feeling vulnerable is, I think that's the key, isn't it? Feeling vulnerable. And it's okay to feel vulnerable. It's okay to maybe make a mistake. It's okay to fail, actually. But if you feel that it was the right thing to do at the time, then the failure can actually lead to other things. It can lead to learning and doing things in a different way another time. And actually failing is in whose eyes is something, you maybe get a 2-star review, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you failed on the project. That it may have so many other things that have been successful. It's just one person's viewpoint, that we're so tied up with judgment, aren't we now? And judgments are normally from financial pressure and But we have to stick to our instincts. That's all we have, isn't it? That's
yeah, exactly. It's all we have, and that, I think, is it's such a powerful sort of message for, especially like young people, whether they're actors or musicians or writers listening into this, to sort of cling on to and to hold dear, because it's, as you say, it's all we have, and all we can do is be true to ourselves and our own integrity and ethos as artists. Because, you know, I was saying to a group yesterday, I spent so many years like you and still have it, this imposter syndrome, and constantly apologizing and constantly hiding away. And it's a waste of time, because actually we do have a lot to offer, and it's really unique what we have to offer. And I just wish, you know, I was able to offer a bit more and not be so timid about stuff. But, you know, it all happens at the right time for, you know, the right reasons, I guess.
Yes, absolutely. I know.
Your agent calling. Get out of that interview.
I'm sorry. I'm just going to put it on airplane mode.
No, of course. And so what about the actor-musician stuff? When was your first sort of foray into the actor-musician world? Did it really exist before you sort of started working on those shows? And tell us a bit about the Watermill and that incredibly fertile and rich period of creativity that you and John Doyle, Craig Revel Horwood, you sort of carved out this incredible moment in British musical theatre.
That's very kind of you to say. So I wasn't the first to do it. In fact, Bob Carlton actually was at the Bubble Theatre, which was a tent that used to tour around the country. And famous, I know a lot of people that were in those early companies. So Bob, the first show Bob did was Return to the Forbidden Planet, which was a sort of rock and roll.
Tempest, his sort of take on Shakespeare, The Tempest, yeah.
Yeah, and for its time, it was really groundbreaking. And I think the journey into that ensemble way of working, which is what certainly draws me to actor-musician shows, was that they were doing a show, and I can't remember which show it was, with a band, and the band kept depping out, and it was causing quite a lot of issues. And I think the director Bob Carlton got so fed up with it. He said, well, we've got loads of people in this company that play instruments, and the next show we do, let's all just play our own music. And sort of how it started, I think. And then
wow,
economics played a big role, and still does. That some in fact, John Doyle would, I think when he ran a lot of rep theatres in difficult times, when sort of Thatcher was sort of, you know, budgets were being squeezed, and a lot of rep theatres were closing and their budgets were being cut. Sounds familiar. So they couldn't afford to put on musicals with big pit bands. And I think John thought, he saw Bob's sort of method, and I think he just thought, well, all right, let's have a go as well. And he did I think the first one he did was at Liverpool, Everyman, in the early 90s, and he did he never did things in half. He did a production of Candide, which is probably one of the hardest scores for actors to play. And I didn't see it, but I believe they had music and they played the overture in full with music on stands, and then the rest of it they learned. I mean, you know, in those days, no one knew about actor musicianship. Now there are courses, and, you know, the bar is much higher. The level of technique and playing is so much higher now. But in those days, I think, you know, it was just, well, do you play a bit of sax, right? Blow. it was sort of basic, but the seeds were there. And John continued on that trend, and I came in, I think the first one I did was back 1993, and I did a production with him of Pal Joey up at York, and they were all actor musicians, but we still hadn't really got it right, because the set, I don't know really what happened with the set design. I wasn't in on any of the chats with that, but for some reason the band were at the back, behind the back wall, so that when they weren't in the scene, they were hidden. I mean, there were little sort of flats and windows that you could sort of see little glimpses of them, but basically they were hidden. And then there were a couple of songs where, you know, they come out and they'd all play, but it was sort of, again, the seeds were there, but it was problematic. It felt like it didn't quite work, and should we just have a band? It didn't. And then John did a production of Into the Woods. Again, I wasn't involved in that one. Kate Edgar, who's an MD, did that one in 1996, and that was like so beautifully done. It was in the, they had a revolve. There was very little set, and what set there was, it all came crashing in at the beginning of Act 2 when the giant comes. But it was so honest. You could see everything. The instruments literally flew in at the beginning on a bar, and everyone, with the costumes, and they just took their instruments and their costumes and off they went. So immediately the audience knew this is what you're going to get. So, and I think that was the key, and is the key, that if you're honest about that these people are going to do everything. So basically, this is what you're in for. You actually stop looking at, I know you've done a few act music, we've done one together. You stop looking at the instruments, don't you, after a while? You forget almost that they're playing. And as long as the storytelling is clear, and I think I did a lot of shows at the Watermill in the 90s and up to about, well, I did one about 3 years ago, which was my last one there, a little night music and Sweet Charity, yeah. But it was time to learn actually how to develop the form, and I know you've done a few shows there. That it's a tiny space. It's 220 seats or something. It's a thrust stage. It can be in the round. I've done a few shows there in the round, but it mainly is a thrust stage. And you can't hide anything. There's no budget for any major set, and what set there is, there's no room for any set. So it's basically an open stage. I think my main, I mean, I loved my time at the Watermill. I mean, you didn't go there for the money. There's no budget. You went there for the art, really. I know that sounds a bit corny, but it was a learning experience. We were allowed to play. We were allowed to take risks. We were allowed to make mistakes, but we were allowed to play and create. I mean, I think because they had such an amazing audience, and still do there, who they sort of have ownership. They love the work there. They feel a part of it. So they will support you. They understand that. I think they understand it, you know, and they'll accept anything. So it was a great time. It was a fantastic time to play. No, but the Watermill will always be very fond in my heart, and I think they were some of the most creative things I've ever been involved with, because you had to reinvent stuff. You couldn't put on a musical in the Watermill and do it, you know, conventionally. It had to be different because there's no space for anything. You had to just concentrate on what tells the story the best at any given time. And if you've got 10 instruments cluttering up the space, it's you just have to be very inventive. And I think I love that. I do love the Watermill. It's and also you sort of go on campus. It's like you're at some boot camp, isn't it? Because it's quite away from the station. And you have to live on site, which is challenging at times, because you do feel like you're some sort of, I don't know, it's like going slightly mad after 4 or 5 weeks there. But what it does is it focuses you on the work, which is really special, I think. You don't have long commutes to get into work. You literally walk across, you know, the car park and past the lovely river and
past the ducks.
Past the ducks.
But you're right, and it's such a sort of creative place. And I think that's what I learned from you working on those actor-musician shows, that normal sort of, you know, tropes or barriers or rules which we stupidly set ourselves in theatre, I mean, all bets are off. You can't take it seriously like that. You have to allow a sense of play and fun and real purest sense of imagination to come through, because you know, if somebody's holding a trombone 1 minute and then, you know, they've suddenly got to walk into a terribly serious scene the next, you have to find a language which allows all of those things to exist together. And that's so liberating, I find. And I try and, I mean, we've done youth theatre projects together, haven't we? Like The Hired Man, where we, you know, not only work with young people, but also with actor musicianship. And, you know, I always try and train myself now, because like you, when I go into those rehearsal rooms, I feel so nervous and so anxious and so terrified that you're not going to be able to do it. And I just think of the freedom that you have when you're doing an actor musician show, or when you're working with young people, when you've given yourself permission to play because of the given circumstance, because it's young people or instruments. You have to be free. You have to free yourself of those normal shackles, and that's when the best sort of creative work comes, I think. Yes,
being free and not thinking, oh, I've got to play that D sharp, or I've got, you know, it doesn't matter, you know. One note isn't going to make it. It's about the intention, and about, as you say, being free. And it's just like picking up a prop. It's just becomes part of yourself. And as long as you're in the moment and you're feeling, you're understanding what that moment is. And the great thing about actor music shows is that everybody's in that moment with you together. That's what I love. I haven't done one for a while, and I really miss them, actually, because of that communal understanding, that connection. You know, there's no conductor dictating what you're doing. Everybody is feeling that moment together, and that wonderful feeling of support and listening. Everybody, the acting musicians are fantastic listeners. I don't always see that in conventional show. I'm not saying it's better. It's just you have to listen more as an acting musician, because you're listening for music, for how it all gels together. You're listening for your cue to play a note, or so. I think the level of listening is so key and I think that's what strikes me from the Watermill is they were so intense sometimes because of that. You know, you don't want to miss anything.
And so talking of intensity, then you were the first woman on Broadway to win a Tony Award for your orchestrations for Sweeney Todd, which I suppose when you're looking at the musical theatre canon, it doesn't sort of get more murderously intense than Sweeney Todd. And you had Patti LuPone blowing a trombone or whatever it was on Broadway there. So can you tell us a bit about your sort of defining memories from that extraordinary production and that remarkable experience?
Well, I remember when John director John Thor asked me to do it, and I said, there's no way we can do an actor musician as Sweeney Todd. It's too hard, you know. I mean, it's like, it's up there with, I mean, I would never do an actor muso version of West Side, but that's because of the choreography and obviously, but just musically it's so complex. We're doing it. Okay, so 4 weeks rehearsal with we didn't finish it at the Watermill. We had to cut some things. So like the letter in Act 2, we had to speak rather than sing it. And this is when we first did it. And I think we had to cut bits and bobs of it, which we put back in later when it started to get a life and a journey. We obviously re-rehearsed and put it all back in. But I remember we rehearsed it in a chip shop on Newbury Racecourse. It was in the winter. I think there was some refurbishments. I can't think that they'd be refurbishing the rehearsal room, because I don't think it's ever been rehearsed at the Watermill. But for some reason we were off site. We were at the chip shop in Newbury Racecourse. It was freezing. But we were sort of in our own little cocoon. There was no one else on site. It's quite a big site. I think we were in the catering department, but it was quite a big space. But we felt very sort of isolated in our own little anxious sort of cocoon. The first preview, Jill Fraser, who ran the theatre at the time, sadly now not with us, and John and I stood outside at 7:25, and we just thought, we weren't ready to open. We just thought, what have we got here? We were so frightened, you know, again, that fear and that risk that this could be disastrous. You know, what is this? What have we done? You know, are we sort of, are we insulting sometime almost, you know? It was very scary. I do remember that, us all standing outside. Anyway, the end of that first show, and there was a sort of silence, because it was obviously, it was quite a dark, well, it's a dark musical anyway, but it was a particularly quite claustrophobic sort of interpretation of it. And at the end of the show, there was just this silence, and then thunderous applause. And I think we all looked around and thought, oh, maybe this is a bit special. And it obviously, it had a bit of a journey. It went on a bit of a tour, and then Sondheim came. That's right. Then it got taken into London to the Trafalgar Studios, and Sondheim came to see it and gave his blessing for it to go to Broadway, which, you know, I mean, it was unimaginable. And again, another thing I remember the very first performance of it at the Eugene O'Neill Theatre, and people clapped as the lights went down, and I was sat next to the sound designer. He had a little walkie-talkie, and I was able to whisper, you know, violin up, and I said, why are people clapping? And he said, because there hadn't been a production on Broadway for quite some years. He said, people are so eagerly awaiting this, but I've never sat there that people clap before the show starts. It was terrifying, really. But yeah, it was a very special time. And when you think it started from nothing, I don't know what the budget was, but it was probably under £10,000. There was nothing. There was not really any set. There was a coffin, there were wood slats, and there were a few chairs. That was the set. And obviously their instruments and very basic costumes. It started from nothing, and had a wonderful journey. It's very humbling, really. But I think the piece itself, it's testament to the piece that there've been so many, you know, and since then there's been the pie shop version, obviously, with an even smaller cast, and the piece still is so strong. And I've seen, you know, an opera house version with hundreds of people, and it still works. So it is testament to the piece that it can take all these, and the generosity of Sondheim, that he allows these interpretations, and is always, and he was incredibly generous to me. And again, you know, I'm so lucky to have had the chance to work with him. And he did come in the last couple of weeks of rehearsals, and he worked with us, particularly on Little Priest. He was very specific. Oh, and the other one he really was specific on was the Judge's Song. That one really meant a lot. He wanted it a certain way. So that was quite bizarre, actually. But, yeah, no, he was just wonderful to work with. Yeah.
And as you say, he's so, you know, like Shakespeare's plays would not be performed today were there a sort of legal requirement that they had to be done as they were 400 years ago. And one of, I know our great frustrations with so many musicals is that they're sort of, you know, sealed in aspic, and these, you know, these rights, you know, you have to do the choreography, you have to do this, you have to do that, as it was done originally in, you know, 1704 or whenever it was. And that's what's so exciting about somebody like Sondheim, you know, with Company last year on the West End, Marion Elliott's fantastic production, and then our new version of West Side Story, the new Broadway version, that he has this appetite for work to be reinterpreted and rediscovered. And I think he's, you know, again, he trusts his ability, and he's not sort of trying to control things.
Absolutely. And I'm sure he wants to find new things. Inevitably, a new interpretation is going to draw out different elements of it, or it's going to maybe concentrate on something a bit different, or the collective effect of what your vision for the piece is going to be different. Yeah, I mean, I think the one thing I take from working and meeting him is his generosity and his absolute instinct for what he does.
Yeah.
Anyone that says he isn't emotional, you know, I mean, because I've heard that his music is quite hard to sort of, but gosh, well,
the music, I mean, the music, I always think that the text of his music and lyrics, the words are like the text an actor speaks. It has the objective, it has the subtext, it has the objective of what you're trying to awaken or do to the other character that you're playing the scene with.
Yeah.
And then where in Shakespeare the emotion and the lyricism and the musicality is in the sort of rhythm and the underbelly of the words, of course in Sondheim it's in the music, and his music is so painfully, exquisitely emotional and filled with humanity. Again, I think it's always odd when I like you hear people say, oh, his work is cold, or it's too esoteric, or it's too intellectual. You think, well, no, God, I mean, that music, it feels like all of humanity is there.
Totally. I feel you, Joanna, or nothing's going to harm. I mean, how can they not be emotive? I mean, it's so, I think there's something, because he writes and obviously lyrics and music, he's doing both. It doesn't always work, but with him, I think Adam Gettle is the same. His music, I know he writes his music first, and sometimes when he's writing, he sort of just the odd word will come out, and then he'll be emoting, but it comes from that place first. And I think the same as with Sondheim. I mean, sometimes you could sort of hear that something is very much lyric led, like Another 100 People or something, obviously, but it feels like the music comes first, and it's beautiful. Yeah. But yeah, it's very inspiring to work with. Yeah, it was a very difficult time, and I feel very lucky, because I think at that time New York had not seen any actor-musician work, so this was the first one they'd seen, and obviously it was right there in front of them. They could see the mechanics of how the music worked within the show, and I think they were sort of taken with that. It's not, I think they see it as a bit of a gimmick. I don't think you don't see many actor-musician shows on Broadway. I think John had another production company that followed the year after, but since then it's not really, which is fine, you know. I mean,
it's not something you can apply to everything, isn't it? I think there's been a bit of a craze in this country that will just do, you know, there's a period where everything seems to be actor musician, and actually it's got to be led from the piece, and you've got to, as you just said, as John did with Sweeney Todd in the first instance, he found a way, he had a vision, an idea that the two would really complement each other, but sometimes it can just be imposed on it, and there isn't really a reason for doing it, and then I think, you know, it's not.
Some work better than others. I mean, certainly with Sweeney, he struggled with the concept first of all. I mean, at one point we were going to set it that they were all in, we had a workshop afternoon where they sort of pretended they were in an asylum, which sort of, there were hints of that, I think, which we ended up with. But we were going to go down the route that they come into the asylum, that they're in a sort of workshop room, and someone comes in and locks the door, and they start the play, and they're doing it every day the same. And there was one workshop where Karen, who played Mrs. Lovett, came in and gave everyone out bonbons. It was just the funniest thing. I mean, it was sort of funny, but it could have worked. We could have gone down more that route. But it was hard. It didn't come straight away, and the sort of quite Brechtian way he directed it. You know, a lot of people. You know, there were scenes where someone would just stand on a chair and talk directly out to the audience. Joanna sang Greenfinch and Linnet Bird, playing the cello, sat on a coffin with the judge stood behind her. I mean, it was all very sort of quite Brechtian, really, but it sort of worked because because the piece was so strong, that the storytelling was there. But it didn't always work, and I think the more successful actor-musician shows I've been involved with, actually the one we did, The Hired Man, it's about community. Spend. I did with Craig Revel-Horwood about a community, and we set it in the pub. A Fiddler on the Roof, community, music, important. So some work better than others, I think. And as you say, I don't think you can just willy-nilly just apply it to any old show. It's not going to add anything. You know, you only do it if you think this is going to be a really interesting way of doing it. It's not better. It's just a choice. It's like setting Shakespeare modern or something. You make a choice on something, and
and where do you see the sort of future of the actor musician movement? Are there shows you'd really sort of love the opportunity to work on and think would work really well as actor musician shows?
There is one I've always wanted to do, which is 9. I know the piece has issues. I think the score is just wonderful, but I love the concept of Guido, the central guy, being the sort of conductor of his female orchestra, or his lovers are his orchestra. And I think conceptually that would be a really, really interesting, I just think the score is sublime, and it would be a great musical for women, actually. And I think I could cast it like that. There are so many brilliant women actor musicians out there, and Guido obviously would be a great role. I think the future of acting, I mean, I think it's very, well, obviously taking the situation we're in at the moment out of the picture, but it's been a very buoyant time for actor musicians' work. Most actor musicians come out of college and they can get some sort of work. I think it's a very good time, and I worry that sometimes they're put on just for economic sake, that they're just like a cheap band, and I think sometimes that exploits actor musicians. I personally will only want to do shows that it's fully, you either do it or you don't. I think the halfway house doesn't really work, and it always sits slightly uncomfortable with me, because I think, oh, well, you should just pay for musicians, you know, do it conventionally. So you either do it or you don't. You go for sort of ensemble. The ensemble, you do it for, you make an artistic choice to do it rather than an economic choice, I think. I would like to see more. I mean, I think we'll talk about it a bit in a minute, but I think the older I get, the more interest I'm in new work. So I think I would be interested in developing more new work with musicianship involved in it. And I didn't see it, but I gathered Benjamin Button, was it a Southwark Playhouse, which was a new piece that had a few actor musicians in, and I think it was conceived for actor musicians. On saying that, I don't think you should write saying this is an actor musician piece. I believe that if a piece is good, like Sweeney, if you put an actor musician treatment on it, then that's fine, or it can work without it. I don't believe this can only be done as an actor musician show. But I hope the ensemble, for me, it's all about the ensemble. I hope and that's why I loved our version of The Hired Man, with these amazing not youngsters, but teenagers who have, a lot of them have all gone on to do great things, haven't they now? But what they had was freedom that we spoke about earlier. They were fearless, and we asked them to do quite brave things on stage. But I'm very proud of that production, and I know, you know, it was very moving, wasn't it, at times in that rehearsal room? Their passion and their total commitment to the project was amazing. So I'd like to see that sort of continuing.
Yeah, I think we see it so much, like with our Curve Young company. They're just so free, and they're not sort of censored, and they don't sort of have this baggage of being an adult and worrying so much about, you know, what the world will think of, you know, what they're doing. And I think it's just so refreshing. And as you say, that Hired Man experience, they were just so free, and it just felt so effortless. And any idea that was sort of brought into the space, people would run with it. And, you know, I remember there seemed to be moments where, you know, we were looking at a scene or a number for, you know, the first time, and we'd sort of have a bit of a discussion and then, you know, start, and then it just seemed to run, and it was like, well, have they rehearsed this secretly by themselves without us? Because it all seems to just be there and so exciting and like complete. And it was just that it all just sort of coalesced, didn't it? And there was that wonderful thing in theatre where sometimes everything just works, and it really does feel effortless, and they're few and far between, but when they come, we really relish them.
Oh, definitely. There's one of my other favourites was, we did my first show with Craig Revel Horwood at the Watermill was Hot Mikado, And he did this ridiculous routine at the end of Act One. It was a sort of joy, with trumpets going. And thankfully, I was at the piano, so I was static. But I remember one of the actresses looking back at me, because I was sort of at the back, and she was doing this, and she was looking back going, but it literally was joyous. And whereas Sweeney had been so intense and so dark, I remember Jill Fraser, it was the last one, it was so sad, it was the last show she was involved with, and it did sort of raise the roof of it. It was sort of electric. So that, and again, that total joy. It was, I do remember that very clearly.
Well, my goodness, we're going to need lots more of that when this lockdown is lifted and we can get back into our theatre. So you touched on a little bit about new work, and I know you especially enjoy creating new work, and the times we've been together in, you know, rehearsal room when we're putting something new together or a sequence musically, you never seem more sort of filled with joy and sort of you never seem more inspired. What is it about new work that sort of fuels you like that?
Yeah, I think I think it is just the feeling of creating something for the first time. I used to write. I don't really write as in compose. I used to. I've written over the years. I've written sort of stuff, a lot of kids stuff, and a couple of musicals. I always felt someone else could do it better. I wasn't cutting edge. I'm very good at pastiche. I'll still write kids shows. Got a kids show at the Hastings White Rock this Christmas. Title to be announced. But I think now my involvement.
Tickets available. Check the website.
Yes. It's more about orchestration and supervising, and so I think it's the collaboration. I mean, we collaborate on pieces. I do like the collaboration of trying to get into a composer's head as to what it is they are trying to get out on the page. So I'm doing two new works this year. One is with Douglas Hodge at Regent's Park. And he's he's a great actor, very, very incredibly instinctive. And he can't write anything down, so he gets very frustrated. But he can play, and he plays a bit of piano, a bit of guitar, but he just thrashing. He's got is this amazing instinctive instrument, his voice. And my challenge is to transcribe what it is he's trying to get out on the page, and then get into his head about the soundscape that he wants. But he is really eclectic. He's a great Tom Waits fan. He really knows what he wants. He hears. So it's me trying to get into his head to then be his writer in a way as to what he wants. It's not without its challenges. And then I work with other people. I'm doing a job at the RSC Clown this Christmas, where I'm a co-orchestrator with the composer. So he is already busily writing down and putting ideas down, and I'm more of a sort of soundboard to bounce off and input work. But again, that's more about I don't want to push in too much, because it has to come from him. I'm just facilitating a bit more with that.
Yeah.
So every job is a bit different, but it is about the collaborative. I love collaborating. I'm an accompanist, so that's a collaboration. I don't like being on my own. I like being in a rehearsal room. I like bouncing, as you say, you know, if we're ever working on, this bit of underscore isn't working here, what can we do here? Then that feels incredibly creative and exciting, and we can put a bit of ourselves into it. And with always respecting whoever's written that piece, trying to, again, be in their sort of thoughts or soul. What would they write, or what would they do at this bit? So I find that and just the whole thing of new work is hard, you know. And musicals they're a long birthing process. They do take some take many years, some take many months, but it's all about the investment getting the right investment, getting the right time, and development. Development is key. I know we've done a couple of workshops together, and they are really important to really pick the piece, delving into the piece, and what's going to work well here. Song placements. It's the collaborative creative sort of journey I really like on a new piece. And again, you might think it's going to fail. Who knows? You might think it's amazing, but then it may come across as just not quite working, or the storytelling isn't right. But I think it's a collaborative thing I really like.
And what do you, aside from what's going on in the world right now, what do you sort of imagine to be the major challenges facing British theatre generally over the next sort of decade or so? Where do you think those challenges are going to come from?
Well, I mean, we've got to talk about investment, haven't we? I mean, money is always going to be a challenge, and it always is anyway when things are good. I think we're just recovering from the 2009 sort of crash, and I don't know about you, but I feel the knock-on of that was a few years down the line. It wasn't. We didn't feel it immediately. It feels like things have squeezed only in the last sort of 5 years. I think and again, it's going back to what we talked about at the beginning of the conversation, that the appreciation of funding in schools and colleges and of the arts, it goes right the way through, doesn't it? And I think everything feels squeezed at the moment, and that's taking out what's happening at the moment, because it's going to obviously be very tough to come out of this, and theatre is going to need a lot of investment and help and confidence in theatre goers coming back to theatre. But I do think, particularly for new work, which has to be the future. I mean, there's only so many jukebox and film
and revivals that we can do, because there's going to come a point where everybody's just simply seen them.
Yeah, and we have to have. There's not a lot of new stuff coming out. I mean, there's plenty of new stuff being written, but it's just not getting to that final development stage. And the glory days of Lloyd Webber, and in the the early noughties and the 90s, where things were just, we were the trailblazers of new work. In America, they do invest more, and that's why a lot of the stuff coming over now, the Hamiltons and what's the latest?
Well, like Dear Evan Hansen, for example, the band's visit. There's been a sort of a stream in recent years of new musicals, which I guess not only come from away, and they're all different musically and in terms of structure and the way they carry the art form of the musical forward. It's really phenomenal.
So that has to be, for me, the way forward, which is, I think, why the older I get, the more I want to be involved in trying to help that along. And it's not saying I don't want to do any revivals, because there's still revivals I'd love to do, but I think new work, we have to fight for new work in this country, because it's the only way I think eventually our industry is going to stay current and stay buoyant and stay challenging, and hopefully we will have a lot still to say in 50 years time, because it's important. We are a social comment, and people need to empathize and feel and be taken out of themselves, and we can only do that when we're challenging and being humane. It's about humanity. I think the humanity aspect is important as well.
And what?
Sorry, go on.
No, go on, please.
No, I mean, the one thing I would say is that I think standards, I think we were lagging behind technically with American, in all aspects actually, in performers, technical sort of aspects. I think we've caught up. I mean, it's very technical now, theatre. I feel a little bit left behind at times. When we're in a tech and everything's synced up with time code, and lighting is synced to sound, is synced to automation, is synced to blah, and if one of those elements goes, everything sort of, it used to be everything sort of, you pull a flat down, or you'd do a fader up on a, everything is so automated, which in some ways is really good because it means you can do more, but in other ways I don't know. I don't know. I'm sort of always torn between the automation thing and the same thing about performers in their training. Technically, I think we were very behind American training a few years ago. I think we have caught up, and we've certainly caught up, I think, technique-wise. Would you agree? Sort of singing and dancing and general.
But sometimes to the detriment to sort of heart and feeling, I think. I mean, yes. We've often commented in auditions, haven't we, that people are very sort of technically proficient, but actually what all of these shows need, certainly when we've been working on West Side, which is the most recent one, and Grease, is we need young people who are not afraid to bare their souls and have an understanding of who they are and what they want to offer the world and what they want to say about the world. But it's all behind this sort of slightly, vacant mask of being able to sing it well and dance it well and act it to a certain standard. But if none of those things are coming from an inherent burning sort of place of, identity, then it doesn't mean anything.
Absolutely. I totally agree. And I think actors sometimes they want to be just told to stand. They're not brave, or they don't know. They've just not been encouraged to just play and just use their instinct, or don't be afraid to make a mistake in the rehearsal room. If you can't just try something out in a rehearsal room, then you're never going to find something exciting to sort of end up with, or you're never going to develop as an actor personally.
I mean, the very old-fashioned way of doing it was the actor would come and offer ideas for the director or the musical supervisor, and you would then sort of edit. You'd have a load of ideas up your sleeve about how you're going to play something. And you're right, there are moments sometimes where you really want to see the personality and the playfulness and the sort of endeavor of the performer. Otherwise it's just sort of, it doesn't mean anything. You stand there, play it like this, sing it like that. I mean, it's sort of nonsense, isn't it? I mean, it's such a bovine level. I mean, thankfully we're not sort of doing that on our productions because we work with amazing people, and with Kay and the team, we get incredible actors into our shows, incredible creatives. They're all creatives, aren't they?
Absolutely. And that's exciting in a room where you're all collaborating together. There's no ego. It's not like, oh well, I wanted to have that idea, or I mean, it's like, we'll celebrate the idea. If that's a good idea, if that's what's going to work,
exactly,
let's all work with that idea. That's exciting. That's surely what it's about, and that it's a collective way of working, again in the ensemble.
And we sort of touched on it a little bit, but what sort of advice would you have for an actor starting out, or somebody who wants to follow in your footsteps, whether it's through orchestration or musical supervision? What are Travis's top tips?
Travis' top tips.
Top tips.
I think there's no easy answer. Like, if you do this, this, and this, then you're gonna, have a career. But I think it's being open. That would be my top tip. Being open to anything and learning from everything. Learning by mistakes. We're still learning by our mistakes. Just being open like a sponge. Talk to as many people as possible. Shadow people, learn from people, and just immerse yourself in it. I know that's not always practical in earning a living from it, which is hard. That's the hard bit, isn't it? It's trying to do stuff that maybe you're not going to get paid for, but also maybe have a job on the side. I don't know. But I think it's just being open to experience, and try and I think it goes with how you are as a person as well, that the more you develop as a person, the more open you are, then you will develop as well. It's about life skills. So much of our business is about learning life skills, I think, and then transferring them and trying to open up what you have to give. It sounds a bit corny as well, but I think if you're not open, you're never going to connect with anyone. And collaboration, I think, is really important. That would be another top Trav tip, is being open to collaborate. So listening
Yeah.
Not always thinking that you're right, that if you're collaborating, you may not agree with a decision, but you think, okay, well, let's go with that and let's see. And then you might come to something in the middle, or it's about listening, collaboration.
Well, they're wonderful top tips from Trav there. Thank you. So just to finish off, I mean, it's been incredible talking to you, and I've certainly learned a lot, and I'm sort of humbled by your wisdom, and it's just such an honor to talk in this way, because obviously so much of the time we're in the, you know, the heat of the rehearsal, and we're sort of, you know, on to the next thing, and it's so busy. So it's just been so wonderful to chat like this. But I'm just curious to sort of finish up. Again, we sort of touched on it before, but what role do you think a theatre like Curve has moving out of this crisis? Where do you see a theatre like Curve? Obviously, you care about us so much. You're an associate artist. You're part of the family. What do you think our sort of contribution is to the sort of our communities going forward from this lockdown and this crisis?
Well, I think you just said community, and I think when I was thinking about this last night, I've always felt with Curve, from the first time I walked into the building, it's always felt like a hub or a central part of Leicester community. And what you've managed to achieve, you and Chris, with the theatre, is you've opened up your space to the youth theatre, to the over 50s dance classes, to the 2 or 3 boys, teenagers that do their break dancing in the corridor, to the gospel choir that always makes me cry on a Wednesday evening, or whenever it is, on the mezzanine. The space is always being used for people, and it's the most welcoming space. People can just come in and have a cup of tea and just sit and take it all in. I think the sense of community there is going to matter more and more. That's apart from all the work that you do, and the theatre and the shows, and that obviously that speaks for itself. But for me, it's the community aspect of it, that people have somewhere that they can go and meet people and talk about it, and they can watch theatre that maybe connects with them. There's all sorts of workshops I know that you offer, and courses. There's just always something going on, which I think is wonderful, and we need that in a community. So I would say community is going to be the way forward for Curve, and for patrons and anyone else who wants to come in and get some support, or come in and have a chat, or come in and see what's happening. And
Well, obviously we couldn't agree with that sort of sentiment more, and just to say thank you so much, Sarah. It's been such a privilege talking to you. Thank you.
It's been a joy. Thank you, Nikolai.